Welcome to Podkey Daily News, your fast brief on the biggest global developments. Today's pressure points are clear. Immigration policy with real human costs, war that's widening its economic reach, and extreme heat disrupting ordinary life. A few of these stories look local on the surface, but the practical impact is much bigger. The clearest immigration story here is how a random visa draw and a policy swing can change an entire life. The diversity visa program gets more than 20 million applications a year and issues only about 55,000 visas. For people fleeing instability, it really can be the lottery of a lifetime. One example is Abdi, a Somali immigrant whose 2013 selection let him escape a path shaped by civil war, famine, bombings, family loss, and later the threat of al-Shabaab. His route out ran through Kenya, where he faced discrimination and the risk of deportation before reaching the United States, which is why later U.S. policy changes hit so hard. Trump-era restrictions, including the Somalia travel ban and cuts to refugee resettlement funding, cost him his nonprofit job and his health insurance. That's the practical point. National immigration policy doesn't stay abstract for long. Abdi also says the second-term suspension of the diversity visa program deepened fear in communities that had already fled violence, while anti-immigrant rhetoric casts Somali arrivals as a threat. What to watch next is whether visa access, refugee funding, and country-specific restrictions keep tightening, because those decisions directly shape family reunification, employment, and local community stability. Abdi's experience also shows the harder second chapter after arrival: fitting in, finding stability, and trying to build wealth in a much tougher housing market. He describes mixed treatment in Maine, with decent immediate neighbors but subtler discrimination elsewhere, and he argues for bicultural belonging. Keep Somali language and customs but participate fully in civic life, including voting. He says U.S.-born Somali youth often struggle with that dual identity, which matters because integration pressure doesn't end once someone gets legal status. On economics, he says, home ownership, one of the classic markers of the American dream, feels out of reach for many immigrants because of high prices and systemic barriers, even as he sends remittances back to improve family housing in Somalia. He also publicly condemned the massive Minnesota COVID fraud case involving Somali American individuals, arguing the community has to call out misconduct clearly, so the actions of a few don't define everyone else. Iran is treating public imagery as strategy right now. State media has branded Ayatollah Khamenei's week-long ceremony the funeral of the century, with tents, transport, and even Wi-Fi deployed to project scale and control. Officials are treating turnout as a measure of regime legitimacy at home and abroad. The bigger practical issue is the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is signaling that control of the strait remains a bargaining chip if any U.S.-Iran ceasefire breaks down. That matters because the strait carries critical fuel and fertilizer shipments. Any disruption would move quickly into global prices, supply chains, and diplomatic pressure. At the local level, people in Bandar Abbas describe the usual pattern of geopolitical confrontation: scorching heat, job losses, and fear of speaking openly, while officials push claims of victory. One caution here: a faulty media transcript falsely said Khamenei had been killed earlier in the war. On stories, this sensitive bad transcription can become geopolitical misinformation fast. Ukraine's message after the latest deadly strike is blunt: delayed air defense deliveries are costing civilian lives. President Zelensky tied a Kyiv apartment building collapse directly to slow arrival of promised systems and is pushing for more interceptors and a U.S. Patriot production license. At the same time, Ukraine is trying to impose costs on Russia farther from the front. Since March, it has carried out more than 50 long-range drone attacks on Russian oil refineries, contributing to fuel shortages inside Russia. Kyiv is also building domestic capacity, including long-range strike drones and testing by Firepoint on an anti-ballistic interceptor. A CSIS report cited by Ukrainian officials puts Russian casualties at nearly 8 times Ukrainian losses, which Kyiv is using to argue the Kremlin's approach is grinding down its own forces. What to watch is whether Western air defense deliveries accelerate and whether Ukraine's deep strike campaign keeps degrading Russian logistics and energy infrastructure. The UN is warning that El Obeid could be on the edge of mass violence, with comparisons to El Fasher, where more than 6,000 people were reportedly killed in days. Humanitarian access is blocked, and the UN human rights system is again confronting its core limitation. It can warn, document, and pressure, but it does not have peacekeeping forces or sanction authority on its own. That is why calls for Security Council reform are back, including proposals to limit veto use in atrocity situations. The immediate thing to watch is whether access opens at all, because without it, the warning phase can turn into another post-facto accounting of a preventable massacre. In the United States, the holiday story with the widest practical reach is the heat. A broad heat wave forced cancellations of 4th of July parades and fireworks, including Washington's parade and displays in Colorado towns such as Durango and Vail. On the National Mall, temperatures were expected around 101 degrees with a heat index near 114, and officials were pushing people indoors, restricting some items, and setting up free hydration stations. Even then, visitors were facing steep vendor prices, including $5 for a 20-ounce water bottle and $10 for lemonade. This is where climate stress becomes a daily life story rather than a policy debate. Canceled events, public safety warnings, and basic heat survival becoming part of how major civic rituals are managed. Two U.S. political stories are intersecting around identity and coalition management. First, Trump's 250th anniversary rally framed him as an heir to the founders, part of a broader effort to claim the founding story as political property. Historians argue the American founding myth has always been contested and repurposed, from invented moral fables about Washington to later fights over slavery, Jefferson, Hemings, and Frederick Douglass's use of the Declaration. The practical takeaway is that the founding narrative remains an active political tool, and the argument now is over how much myth a country can keep while still facing historical fact honestly. Second, Democrats are dealing with primary results that show real appetite for challengers from the left, including races in Denver, New York City, and the defeat of Adriano Espaillat by Darialisa Avila Chevalier. Party leaders see the risk clearly. Progressive energy can mobilize core voters, but positions on immigration, Israel, and Gaza, and campaign finance may be easier to paint as extreme in swing districts. What to watch is whether the party treats these wins as a local protest signal or the start of a broader ideological shift. That's the brief for today. You're listening to Podkey Daily News, and we'll be back with the next round of developments. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.
Podkey.